This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
Do you notice anything wrong with this sign? If you look in the lower left-hand corner and see the nonsense syllables, it may help point up for you and me the importance of names, the names of these Irish cities, or names in general. Names are very important, but on this Irish Diary, I'd like to talk about the names of Irish towns. I know you've heard them and perhaps you've remarked on their musical qualities. I'd like to go a little bit deeper than the music, but just consider for a moment how few of our really native and picturesque names we have had spared to us in this country. We have very few Dead Men's Gulch towns or anything of that nature left. And in Minnesota here we have a Pig's Eye Lake, but generally, you know, we've become so respectable and so conscious of our image everywhere in the world these days that we rather look upon such plain names with disfavor, and we shelve them for something else, far less authentic. I can remember when I was living in New Hampshire, for instance, that the State Planning and Development Association got a sudden urge to change all the ponds into lakes. It looks prettier for the visitors, you know. Ponds is a bit too homey. Well, you consider the names of most of our cities. We have cities like or towns and cities like Frankfurt, Berlin, Boston, New York, San Francisco. Now, these, you see, aren't really native to our traditions. They were native to the first settlers who brought those names from Europe. But the really native ones are Dead Men's Gulch, Pig's Eye Lake, and things of that sort, and we rapidly move those out. It's too bad, perhaps. So that when we become interested in traditional names and their significance and all their import for us, we generally have to turn to Europe. And in turning to Europe, I'm going to turn to Ireland. Turn to an old country and come across names. You can reach in a hat and pull out a dozen. Aherlow, Auchnacloy, Ballina, Ballinasloe, Ballyboffey, Boolavog, Capoquin, Carrigaholt, Clonakilty, Donaghadee. Very musical, very interesting. Now, of course, they're musical to us because they're strange to our ear. But they're strange to our ear because they're really a foreign tongue. This is simply the nearest English phonetic treatment that we can get of them. But they're different from our names because these are part and parcel of the tradition of that countryside. We're not interested in this program in their musical quality. We're interested in their traditional lore, in the legendary associated with them. Now, almost every Gaelic name, but not quite, but almost every Gaelic name has been converted phonetically into some sort of English approximation. Belfast is a Gaelic name. Bale Fershte, Belfast. Tyrone, Tir Owen. Donegal, Donegal. Derry, Derra. Cork, Kirkee. Limerick, Limerick. Killarney, Killarney. You see, the sounds in English are roughly approximate. But I'm not interested in this aspect of it. I want to come immediately to the legends that surround these particular places. This, I think, is what's fascinating and makes so much human history for us. Now, there are several ways in which legends become attached to places. Let us say they become attached extrinsically. You know the legends of Blarney, Blarney Castle, how Queen Elizabeth, in her desire to have the great McCarthy, who was the lord of that place, in her desire to have him brought under English law and control, she kept pressing him, her agents did, kept pressing him for expressions of fealty and allegiance and so on. And he was, with very persuasive and subtle speech, he was able to keep putting them off, and they always went back with a little bit less than they had asked. And she said, "Oh, this is just Blarney." Well, but that, you see, is only a legend associated with Blarney. And it doesn't, it's extrinsic. It doesn't come to the heart of what I want to come to on this particular number of our series. I want to come to what gave the place its name. And this association with persuasive talk doesn't at all explain the nature of Blarney, Blarney Castle. Now, the same might be true of Killarney, for instance. Killarney is alive with legends. I have no intention of repeating them here. But there are so many legends associated with Killarney, but they don't tell us how Killarney got its name. And then if one were to visit some of the old spots of pilgrimage where saints many centuries ago had their hermitage, we find there are associations there with what are called the saints' beds, these stone hollows where the saints reportedly spent their night's sleep. And there are legends now that if a woman, a pregnant woman, for instance, is to lie here, she will have a happy childbirth. These, again, are legends that are associated extrinsically with places. What I'm interested in today is, how did a place get its name? Now, these are fascinating, fascinating. Some of them are quite easily explained. They're, shall we say, topological. In other words, when we look upon a scene such as this one at Glendalough, we can see the two lakes. You see the nearer one there, just over the trees, and we see the farther one. And we note the steepness of the mountain sides, and we know we're in a glen. So that this famous place, quite near Dublin, Glendalough, simply describes, it got its name from its topology, the glen of the two lakes. Well, there are other examples in the country. For instance, here in Adair, County Limerick, by the ruins of Adair Castle, by the way, the old Fitzgerald Castle. But here you see the rushing waters, and the name of this simply means the ford of the oak. And oak trees grew in profusion on the bank at the point where it was forded. So again, you see, Adair. And then we turn to the west of the country for another slight example of this sort of names. And again, we see the waters here. See, the waters are very significant in human civilization. And where the bridge is now, years ago, there was a ford. So here at Ballina, we have a name, Baal and Aha, the mouth of the ford. So these are easily explained, you see. Here are three places which have been given names simply to describe their physical characteristics. That's the way we give nicknames to people, isn't it? We call someone fatty or someone skinny. We're just trying to express the physical characteristics. Now again, although the whole country is filled with that kind of lore, I don't propose to spend any more time on that. There are a few places then that took their names from families. Now Castlebar, for instance, would be Cashlawnwari in Irish, or Barry's Castle. Lahinch in Clare, takes its name from the monument of the O'Connors, Lac de Crohur. And we mentioned Tyrone before, or Tyrone. Tir Owen, the land of Owen O'Neill. So that's another way, sometimes then from physical characteristics, sometimes from associations with a family. But now we come to the ones which I think are much, much more interesting, because these are intrinsic explanations of how a town got its name. And there are many ways. Sometimes it was associated with magic. Now, for instance, and you may not believe some of these tales, but I think we'll show you. Now, there was a smith by the name of Gavla, who was a smith to the very ancient peoples of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, Tuatha Dé Danann. Now, this smith was himself quite a magical man. He forged the magical weapons for the Tuatha Dé Danann. But he had a cow, and I'd say it ran him a close second in magical qualities, because it gave as much milk as anyone could ever want, so that it made the circuit of the district, and some say of the whole country, but it made the circuit of the district of Glengevlin in County Cavan, and it gave as much milk as people wanted. They simply brought their pails and milked away and got all they needed. Now, that particular place is now called Glengevlin, and here is that glen. Now notice the term isn't given to it to describe the properties of the glen. The term is given to it to describe the properties of the cow. So you see, this particular place in County Cavan took its name now from a magical cow which 2,000 and more years ago gave its magical milk in this district. I should conclude that story by telling you how a woman of perhaps nasty disposition got the better of the cow. It was well known, of course, that this cow would give milk fill any pail, no matter what size. You bring out a wash tub and it would fill it. And this woman said, I know one vessel that this cow won't fill, and she brought out a sieve. And when the cow saw that, the cow galloped away, and it's never been seen again. Of course, if it hadn't been for that, we'd have been able to breed from that cow, and our milk problems would have been settled. But it's unfortunate it got away. Well, now, magic was one sort. There was another origin for some of these names that explain. Take the name Athlone. Many of you may have been to the town of Athlone on the Shannon. Now, how did that get the name Athlone? Well, if you have read Ireland's great epic, Táin Bó Cúailnge, or the great cattle drive of Cooley, you remember that there was a tremendous battle caused in Ireland around, let's say, the beginning of the Christian era, because Maeve, who was a queen in Connacht, was rather envious of other people's wealth. She tallied up her own wealth, personal wealth, as against her husband's, and found that they were pretty evenly matched, except her husband had a very fine pedigreed bull, which she couldn't match at all in quality. But she knew where there was one to be had, and that was the brown bull of Cooley, who was in the north of Ireland in Ulster, and she determined she would have it. She wasn't able to get it peacefully, so she thought she knew a way, and she'd simply send her soldiers up and they'd get it. To make a long story short, this is a great epic, it's Ireland's Iliad, but to make a long story short, this bull was forcibly brought back to Connacht, where Maeve was queen, and it fought with the white bull of her husband's and killed it, and in goring it to pieces, carried away on its horns the haunch of the white bull. And then as it galloped back toward Ulster, it stopped at the boundary there, the River Shannon, and it was so hot and tired from its fightings that as it bent over to drink, the haunch toppled off its horns, And therefore, that is known, that spot in the river is known as Ahlun, or the ford of the haunch. So you see, you can prove it. Athlone is still there. Now, there is a literary origin. We had a magic origin, a literary origin, and now let's take an example from the lives of the kings. There was a king, Ocha, in Tipperary, whose place was on Cashel. You have seen Cashel, the Rock of Cashel, the very famous place in Tipperary. This, however, is the Athlone Ford, which I neglected to draw your attention to. I apologize. But that is the ford now, which is named after the haunch which the brown bull dropped as he bent over to slake his thirst there. But now, I apologize, we'll move on to the story of the king and his son. Well, the king, for instance, was in Tipperary, and of course that meant on Cashel, the hill which you have seen now, this royal hill. And the king's son, unfortunately, had the misfortune of having his father's wife fall in love with him. So we have this triangle over 1,500 years ago. And Evelyn was the wife's name. She and the king's son ran away to the north of Ireland, and they set up housekeeping, and magically a well bubbled up from the ground of the purest, loveliest water. And the king's son had this enclosed right within his house. And knowing that there was something magical about this well, he made sure that it was covered every night. But one night, the housekeeper left it uncovered, and the result was this, that the entire well overflowed and filled hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres. And this is Loch Ness in the north. And it all came because the cover was left off the well. You see, they couldn't have any luck when they ran away like that. So that this was the justice of the gods. They were all drowned, unfortunately. But that's the origin of Loch Ness. There are other stories that explain the origin of that lake, which is the largest lake in either Ireland, England, Scotland, or Wales, the hugest lake in Ireland. There's another story about King's son also. And this is a story about another part of the country, but again, about a lake. And this particular king's son, you see that Loch Ness that we told you about was the lake of the son of Ocha, who was the king. But now we go to Loch Derg in the southern part of Ireland, not the Loch Derg in the northern part. And the Loch Derg means the Red Lake. Well, how did it get that name? Well, it's quite simple. I suppose it's almost a matter of history. The king's son, Yochi was his name, had paid a visit to the north of Ireland to an Ulsterman by the name of Ferchtna. And while they were there, unfortunately, some of the king's son's poets stole a few of the chickens of the Ulsterman. And when he came back down to the south, quite put out because of this thievery of his flock of chickens, when he came back, he demanded that Yochi would give him whatever he asked for as compensation. And of course, one could not be a king's son without being generous. As a matter of fact, the word in Irish for prince is fleadh, and the word for generous is fleadhúil. In other words, like a prince, princely. So in order to right this terrible blemish on the conduct of his retinue, Yochi said, "All right, whatever you ask." Now it so happened that Yochi had only one eye, and the visitor from Ulster said, "Give me your eye." And without a moment's thought, Yochi tore it out of the socket and threw it in the direction where he thought the man to be. And then he went to a pool, or he went to an area where it was marshy. There wasn't a pool there yet. And he pulled up some rushes to get at the water in the marshy place, and a huge lake blossomed forth, and it's Loch Derg, and it's there for you to see today. It's this huge lake on the Shannon, 25 miles long. And it flowed red because he washed out the bleeding wound. This man, incidentally, is reputed to be the ancestor of the O'Sullivans, because the name O'Sullivan, O'Sullivan, means one-eyed, or at least that's one of the stories to explain its meaning. But you notice how this name Loch Derg is explained by a legend. So this is the class of names, I think, that's most interesting. Now there are some, we mentioned some take their origin in magic, some in literature, some in association with historical persons. And the last type we'll mention is the type that has its origin in associations with saints. You've perhaps been through the town Mullingar in Westmeath. Mullingar, very centrally located town, has a lovely explanation for how it got its name. It's associated with Saint Colman, or Colman, Saint Colman. Now it seems that there was a king who had a son by the name of Conall. And Conall sent his butler or his steward to Colman's house to demand of Colman's father and mother their tribute of so many bushels of wheat. But these poor people didn't have any wheat. So the steward left, and he was quite upset, and he said, "You'd better get it or else." And Colman, in the way of the Irish saints of old, he showed a bit of temper. And he said, "May you be swallowed up by the earth." And the man was. But Colman then had to go to the mill where the grain was ground, had to go to the mill to grind their barley, because all they had was barley. And when he got there, he found that the miller was grinding the king's wheat. And he asked the miller, could he stop and do the barley? And the miller said, no, by no means. So Colman said, all right, I'll make a bargain with you. Would you grind my barley and the king's wheat, grind the two of them together, and let God take over the mill to see who will get what? And the miller was nothing less than a sport. He said, surely. And he did that. And as he did it, Colman placed his hand against the side of the mill and pushed. And this caused the mill to reverse its direction. So instead of grinding in a direction from left to right, it ground from right to left. And when it did this, instead of grinding the barley on the left and the wheat on the right, it moved them over, and Colman got the wheat and the king got the barley. But ever since then, it's been called Muilincar, or the left-hand turning mill. So you see, these legends explain how a town got its name. Now, it's the same way if you visit a very famous town in the north of Ireland, the town of Derry. Lovely town on the Foyle. And this got its name because Columkill founded the town because he was so much in love with the oaks that grew by the side of the Foyle. Incidentally, he did found a settlement there in the year 548. Ireland is an old country. Now, so that the Irish name is Dera Columkill, or the Oaks of Columkill, or in English we shorten it to Derry. So you see Dera, Derry. And another example of that is this particular townland in the Mayo. This is Downpatrick Head. Now notice that head of land off in the distance, and you see it's broken. And if it weren't for the testimony of your own eyes, you mightn't believe the story I'm going to tell you. But obviously that the headland was broken away. Now, what happened there at Downpatrick Head was this, that right out at that point, before it was broken away, lived quite a wicked man, and he terrorized the whole countryside. St. Patrick warned him and said, now look here, my jolly good fellow, you better mind yourself. But our wicked old man stayed wicked and continued to terrorize the country. So one day St. Patrick put a curse upon him and cut that part of the land away. So at Downpatrick Head, you have this cut away part of the land because of Patrick's curse upon that evil man, segregating him from the rest of society. And if you hadn't seen it yourself, you might not have believed it. So you see, it's interesting. We have the areas which are now not just described, but they actually, not described according to their physical features, but they are now described according to a legend. And all over the country, you can find these legends. And they're alive, because you have only to get someone who can give you the name in Irish and translate it for you, and he can give you at least its literal meaning, and you can begin there. Now, before we finish this, I want to show you a prominent part of the Irish countryside, which has its own beautiful legend with it. When you travel around Ireland, you will see these Stone Age monuments that go back perhaps 2,000 years before Christ. And they weigh tons and tons. They're massive. Now, to these is given the romantic name, the bed of Diarmuid and Grania. Diarmuid and Grania were lovers who made a circuit of the whole country because they just weren't ordinary lovers. I'll come to that in a moment. But since they made a circuit of the whole country, you find these all over the country. These are dolmens, and there are hundreds of them in Ireland. And Diarmuid and Grania needed 365 of them because they fled for a whole year. You see, Diarmuid had made the mistake of causing Grania, the betrothed of Finn, who was what we might call a king. He was captain of the militia. But Grania was his betrothed, and Diarmuid was such an attractive man that women just couldn't help but fall in love with him. And Grania fell in love with him. Well, this didn't please Finn, and he chased the two of them. And each night, in some other part of Ireland, they had a place like this to sleep. So these are called the beds of Diarmuid and Grania. So you see, the Irish countryside is interesting. The towns have these musical names, musical because it's a language which isn't familiar to our ear, but they have legends. And they also mask descriptions of the countryside. The next time that you visit Ireland, I think you ought to inquire, what do the names mean? Are there any legends in connection with them? And there isn't a name in the north, south, east, or west that doesn't have one of these legends, or at least isn't translatable as a physical description. And this, you see, is a proof of the cultural homogeneity of the country. All of these names translate from the Irish.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.